Why did they single her out? Out of all the faces in the mess hall, why her? The question floated in the air like static, long before anyone touched a tray or poured coffee. She sat alone as she always did, quiet, deliberate, her back to the wall, her eyes sweeping the room in glances so subtle most missed them. To the recruits fresh out of training, she was invisible, just another contractor, temporary. A woman too ordinary to waste a second thought on, but ordinary can be dangerous. Ordinary can be camouflage. And maybe that was the problem. They noticed how she never lingered in conversation, how she cut across the base like water through a channel, efficient, unbothered. No wasted words, no nervous laughter. To them, her silence was weakness. To her, it was survival. By the end of the week, whispers trailed her like shadows. Some called her standoffish. Others thought she believed she was better than them. They joked about her at night, loud enough for her to hear. None of them knew what her silence really meant. Not yet. The sun over Fort Red Haven burned pale, bleaching the motor pool and supply yards into harsh white light. Forklifts rumbled. Crates stacked in perfect grids. Boots rang sharp against concrete. It was a rhythm as old as the base itself. She moved through it all with calm certainty. She didn't look lost. She didn't look temporary. She looked like she belonged, even though her file said otherwise. And Master Sergeant Cole noticed. He always noticed. He'd been in the Army long enough to know when paperwork lied. He saw the tells. The way she positioned herself near exits without ever seeming to. The way her head tilted just enough to sweep a room. The way her shoulders never slumped, even carrying crates twice her size. She didn't look like logistics. She looked like someone waiting. And Cole had seen soldiers wear disguises before. But the recruits, Mason, Troy, Serrano, the others, they weren't trained to notice scars in the shape of posture or silence. They saw only what they wanted to see. And what they wanted was a target. Someone to push, someone to test. Someone they thought wouldn't fight back. The first shove came in the yard. Mason brushed his shoulder against hers, knocking her clipboard to the ground. Papers scattered across the concrete. A pen rolled under a pallet. He kept walking, didn't even break stride. "Watch where you're going," he muttered, loud enough for his friends to laugh. She bent to pick up her papers, calm, deliberate, not a hint of rush in her movements. No heat, no fear, just precision. 2 words slipped from her mouth. Quiet, even, not submissive, not confrontational. A line in the sand spoken so evenly it was easy to miss. Cole heard them. He was 20 feet away, pretending to check a manifest but watching. He saw the shift in Mason's expression. That look, the smug certainty of a young man who thought he'd found weakness. But he hadn't. He'd tugged on a wire he couldn't see. Cole knew it, he'd seen it before. He knew how it ended. By the next morning, the whispers had mutated. Some said she'd bumped Mason first. Others claimed she'd acted like he didn't exist. Truth didn't matter. The recruits were building a story, one where she was cold, arrogant, in need of being put in her place. Cole sipped his coffee, jaw tight. He knew where this was heading. But she gave no sign. She moved through the chow line, sat by the window, ate like it was any other day, back to the wall, eyes sweeping exits. When she finished, she stacked her tray neatly, wiped her table and left. If her silence bothered them, it only made them hungrier. By midweek, Mason and his crew had turned curiosity into fixation. They lingered in doorways she passed through, let their shoulders brush hers in narrow halls, laughed louder when she was in earshot. They thought they were hunters, but they were circling prey they didn't understand. And she made a choice. One change, just one. She stopped avoiding the mess hall at peak hours. She sat where she wanted. If they wanted to follow, let them. She wasn't surrendering ground. Cole overheard Mason outside the motor pool on Thursday night. His voice pitched low but sharp. "No one's that quiet unless they've got something to hide." Troy's laugh was careless, or she just thinks she's better than us. Either way, they decided they were going to find out. Cole hated those words. He'd heard them before. They never ended well. Saturday morning. The mess hall was thin weekend rotation, only a handful of stragglers eating late. She took her seat near the windows, a tray in front of her, coffee steaming against pale light, scrambled eggs cooling under the heat lamp glow. She ate slowly, methodically, her fork rising and falling in rhythm with her breath. That's when Mason spotted her. His conversation faltered, his eyes sharpened, hungry. They didn't speak the plan aloud. They didn't need to. A week of circling had led to this. They entered together, not in formation, but close enough to feel like a wall. Mason led, the others spreading to cover exits. To an outsider, it was just 5 men walking into a cafeteria. To her, it was a net closing. She didn't tense, she didn't even look up. Her fork lifted. Her gaze flicked across them in fragments, mapping positions the way a cartographer maps a coastline, distance to the MPs finishing their late breakfast, angle of the serving line, width of the nearest exit. Every detail logged. No panic, just readiness. Mason reached her table first. Morning, his voice calm, too calm. She sipped her coffee. Morning. He leaned against the chair opposite her. We were just talking about you. Her reply was cool. Can't imagine why. Mason slid into the seat without asking. Because you're a mystery, and mysteries need solving. Her eyes met his, steady. You don't want to know the real me. He chuckled. That's the problem. You think you get to decide how this goes. Behind her, one of his crew shifted. Not casual anymore, weight on the balls of his feet, ready to close in. From the doorway, Cole entered quietly, stopping just inside. He felt the tension thicken like smoke. He could have intervened, could have shut it down, but something in him held back. He wanted to see how far Mason was willing to push, and how far she was willing to let him. Mason leaned in, voice low but sharp. You can walk with us now, or... The word hung heavy. Her gaze didn't flinch, or what? A ripple passed through the table. Mason's smirk strained, brittle. Serrano grinned, tapping his knuckles against the surface. We can make this easy or messy. Her tone was quiet, even, unshaken. You're confusing messy with dangerous. They're not the same. The room stilled. Even the MPs turned their heads. Troy placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, soft enough not to draw attention, firm enough not to be friendly. That was the line. She set her fork down, picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, placed the cup back with precision. Then she removed Troy's hand, not roughly, not enough to alarm the room, just a simple grip, a downward twist, release. Troy blinked, staring at his wrist, unsure how she'd broken his contact so easily. Her voice carried, quiet but steady. You don't want to do that. For a heartbeat, Mason faltered, but arrogance carried him forward. We'll see about that. Cole felt inevitability settle over the room like a storm cloud. The countdown had begun. What was she waiting for? That was the question pressing against the silence. She sat there, calm as still water, while 5 young men closed in around her. To Mason and his crew, her quiet was defiance. To Cole, it was something else entirely. A warning. And when the first hand reached again for her shoulder, everything changed. The instant his fingers brushed fabric, her body reacted. Her elbow snapped back, sharp, controlled, driving into the gap just beneath his ribs. The air burst from his lungs in a strangled grunt. He stumbled, shock written across his face. At the same moment, her knee rose under the table, cracking into Mason's nose. The sound echoed, cartilage breaking, air rushing from his lungs, sharp under the fluorescent lights. The table screeched as she shoved it aside. Another rushed in, clumsy, furious. She slid inside his reach, hooked his leg, and drove her shoulder into his chest. His own momentum betrayed him. He spun sideways, colliding with his friends, collapsing in a heap of curses and pain. Troy came low, arms wide, trying to wrap her waist. She pivoted, planted her right foot, drove her palm into his jaw. His head snapped back, his knees buckled. He dropped hard, dazed, clutching his face. The fourth charged again, rage blinding him. She caught his arm, twisted at the elbow, and forced him across an overturned chair. A sharp strike to the back of his knee pinned him down, breath ragged, unable to rise. Blood dripped steadily from Mason's nose as he staggered to his feet. Fury burned through his shock. She stepped in, pressed a flat palm against his chest, shoved him back against the wall, not in anger, not in rage, with finality. Her other hand hung loose at her side, ready, waiting. 30 seconds. That was all it took. 30 seconds, and the mess hall was silent, except for the ragged breathing of 5 recruits on the floor. Cole hadn't moved. He stood in the doorway, stunned. He'd seen bar fights, deployment scuffles. He'd seen men swing wild when tempers flared. But this wasn't that. This wasn't rage. This wasn't adrenaline. This was control. Her chest rose evenly, her breath steady, no wasted movement, no hint of triumph. She scanned each man in turn, not to gloat, but to ensure none of them were foolish enough to rise again. Mason spat blood, his lips swelling, his pride broken, his voice slurred. "What the hell are you?" She crouched, met his eyes, no heat, no triumph, just truth. Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy SEAL, Team 4, 2 tour in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, 37 confirmed kills, 16 up close. Her voice carried, not because she raised it, but because it didn't need to. "I'm on medical leave while the Navy decides if my injuries are enough to retire me. I am not a contractor." The weight of her words pressed down on the room like iron. The MPs in the corner froze, their casual slouch gone in an instant. The kitchen clatter stilled. Even Cole, who had suspected something, felt the gravity of her revelation. She straightened, picked up her coffee, drained the last swallow, set the cup down. "I changed my schedule to avoid you. I stayed out of your way. You decided quiet meant weak. That was your mistake." Silence heavy, absolute. One recruit lay flat on his back, gasping for breath. Another clutched his jaw. Troy leaned against an overturned chair, arm cradled against his ribs. Mason slumped against the wall, pale beneath blood. She adjusted her shirt, collected her tray, carried it to the return line. She rinsed her cup, stacked her silverware neatly, placed everything where it belonged. And she walked out of the mess hall without looking back. The silence she left behind was heavier than the fight. When the MPs finally moved, it was like stepping into a minefield. They scanned overturned chairs, spilled food, 5 broken recruits, and then looked toward the door she had exited. One let out a low whistle. What the hell just happened? But no one answered. Mason muttered through blood, eyes dazed, staring at the ceiling. The others avoided eye contact. Their silence was confession enough. By nightfall, the story had already fractured. Some said she snapped. Others swore she had been waiting for the fight. The details bent in retelling, but one truth remained. 5 men had cornered one woman. And 30 seconds later, they were all on the ground. Cole knew better. He knew what he'd witnessed. This wasn't a freak accident, it was a reminder. You don't pick fights with people whose silence you don't understand. That evening he found her on the perimeter road. The sun dipped low, bleeding orange across the horizon. She ran at a steady pace, strides smooth, her breathing even. He caught up. His lungs burned harder than he wanted to admit. "You could handle that differently," he said. Not an accusation, not a warning, just truth. Her gaze stayed forward. Her pace never broke. "And let them think they were right about me," she shook her head. "Sometimes walking away buys you more than it costs, but sometimes it just invites them to try harder. They ran in silence for a stretch, footsteps, cool air, the rhythm of breath. Cole studied her profile, the scar along her jaw catching the last light. He understood now why her presence had unsettled him. She wasn't here for them. She was here because the world outside didn't know what to do with her. "They'll make noise about this," he said finally. "They can make all the noise they want," her voice steady. "I've already moved on." Cole almost admired her certainty. Almost. But he'd been around long enough to know noise had consequences. "You might be done with it," he said. "Doesn't mean they are." She veered toward contractor housing, pace unbroken. "I'm not looking for trouble, Master Sergeant, but I won't avoid it at the cost of self-respect." He slowed, let her go, watched her fade into shadows, her stride steady, her resolve unshaken. He wasn't sure whether to respect her more or worry about what came next. Because trouble had a way of circling back. And when it did, he suspected she'd meet it the same way she had today. Calm, controlled, merciless. By morning the summons arrived, formal, typed, bearing the base commander's seal. She was ordered to appear at 900, so was Cole. The MPs, too. Mason and his crew scheduled for separate interviews to prevent collusion. The mess hall incident was no longer rumor, it was official. And in a sterile conference room where truth and consequence collided, the story of 30 seconds was about to be dissected. Word by word. Frame by frame. But Cole knew something no one else did yet. The fight was only half the story. The real test was what came after. What could she possibly say that the footage didn't already show? That question tightened in Cole's chest as she stepped into the conference room the next morning. The walls were government gray, bare, no artwork, no flags, blinds half drawn against the sun. A single long table split the room in two, officers on one side, those summoned to account on the other. At the head sat Colonel Reeve. Cropped hair, cropped words. His reputation preceded him. He saw through excuses the way fire burns through paper. To his right, the base legal advisor, pen already tapping against her notepad. To his left, the senior MP, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Cole sat 2 chairs down from the end, his posture upright, his hands folded. He wasn't there to save her. He wasn't even sure he could. He was there to witness. She entered without hesitation. No fidgeting, no folding of arms. She sat with her hands resting neatly on the table, her face calm, her eyes steady. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. If she was tired, she carried it like part of her uniform. Reeve wasted no time. "We've reviewed the footage." His voice was clipped, stripped of inflection. "You incapacitated 5 soldiers in approximately 28 seconds. She said nothing. The silence stretched. The legal advisor leaned forward. "Miss, for the record, can you explain what led to this confrontation?" Her answer came steady. 5 soldiers surrounded me while I was eating. They blocked the exits, made verbal demands, initiated physical contact. I acted to remove the threat. The senior MP raised a brow. His tone tested the words. "Remove the threat. You did more than remove it. You dismantled it." Her eyes never flinched. They stopped being a threat once they were on the floor. Reeves' gaze narrowed, measuring her restraint against her precision. "You could have called for assistance." "I didn't have time." "And yet," Reeves said, glancing at his notes, "you had time to break one man's nose, drive an elbow into another's solar plexus, execute sweeps, joint locks, controlled takedowns." Her voice never wavered. "I've trained for worse in less time." The room stilled. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. Cole studied her profile, the faint scar along her jawline, the way her gaze stayed forward, never breaking. She wasn't just defending herself. She was laying down truth like stone. The legal advisor's pen froze. She glanced up. Your file lists you as a temporary civilian contractor. Would you care to clarify your actual background for the record? The moment stretched. When she spoke, it was like a breath drawn across glass. Clean, sharp, unavoidable. Petty Officer First Class. United States Navy SEAL, Team 4, currently on medical leave pending discharge. The silence broke like a weight dropped onto the table. The legal advisor's expression hardened. The MP leaned back in his chair, exhaling low. Even Reeves' stoic, practiced, let his eyes sharpen. That information, he said slowly, is not in the personnel system accessible to this base. It's not meant to be. Her words carried inevitability, the kind of inevitability that left no room for debate. The MP gave a low whistle under his breath. Well, that explains the technique. Her gaze flicked to him. It explains nothing. I didn't fight because I'm a SEAL. I fought because 5 men left me no other option. Cole spoke before he could stop himself. Sir, I've seen the way those 5 operate. This was coming. She just happened to be the first one to stand her ground. Reeves' eyes snapped to him, sharp, a warning to shut his mouth. Cole swallowed it, but he didn't regret saying it. The colonel folded his hands, tone clipped. We cannot have incidents like this becoming part of the culture here. This is a training environment, not a proving ground for grudges. Her voice stayed steady. With respect, Colonel, they made it one. I ended it. It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't defiance, it was truth, delivered without heat. Reeves studied her for a long moment, then closed the folder in front of him. For the record, he said, you'll receive a written warning regarding engagement with enlisted personnel. No further disciplinary action will be taken. The 5 involved will face internal review. It was as clean an exit as anyone could hope for. But Cole caught the looks exchanged around the table. He knew what they all knew. The official record might close here, but the story wasn't done. Outside, the corridor was quiet. Cole caught up to her, falling into step, his voice low. That went better than it could have. Her reply was calm, almost dismissive. I've been in worse rooms. They're not done, Cole said. They'll chew on this for weeks, might try to use it later. Let them, she gave a faint shrug. I don't plan on sticking around long enough for it to matter. He studied her, looking for something beyond the mask. You planning on disappearing again? Her eyes stayed forward. I never stopped. Her words echoed in his head like a door closing. Back on base, routines resumed. Forklifts rattled through the yard. Engines revved in the motor pool. But the mess hall carried a new weight. The table by the window sat empty more often than not, as though the room itself remembered. The whispers spread. Recruits retold the story with the certainty of witnesses, even those who hadn't been there. Some twisted the details. Some added their own flair. But the bones never changed. 5 men surrounded one woman. 30 seconds later, they were down. Cole noticed the shift. Conversations grew quieter, laughter less careless. The swagger of certain recruits trimmed sharp at the edges, subtle but real. Even Mason's crew changed. Mason still carried his broad shoulders, but the weight behind them was different now. His presence dulled, his smirk quieter, hesitant. Troy avoided communal spaces altogether, trained harder, threw himself into grunt work with restless energy, a silent penance. None of them apologized, but their silence spoke louder than any words. For her, though, it was already behind her. She reclaimed her seat by the window, resumed her runs, stacked her trays with the same precision. She neither sought conversation nor avoided it. Her life moved with the same deliberate rhythm. But Cole knew better. Trouble didn't vanish, it shifted shape. Stories like this didn't stay contained. Not on a base like Red Haven. Not with visitors and rotations and whispers slipping out through cracks no paperwork could seal. And Cole's instincts were rarely wrong. One afternoon, a visiting Navy officer stopped by the supply yard. Salt and pepper hair. insignia half obscured by his jacket. He watched her, not the way a stranger watches, the way someone recognizes. Petty officer. The word landed sharp. She froze for just a fraction of a second before turning, her face neutral, but her eyes betrayed history. Cole caught it, the flicker of recognition. The officer smiled faintly. Didn't expect to find you here. Her reply was measured, temporary assignment. He nodded, but his gaze carried weight. We'll talk before I leave. Then he was gone. Cole saw her movements afterward, sharper, each crate stacked with clipped precision, each breath measured like she was reining something in. He didn't ask, he didn't need to, he knew the pattern. The mess hall fight had been a spark. But the fire it lit was bigger than Fort Red Haven. And soon, whether she wanted it or not, it was going to find her again. Why did the story refuse to die? 2 weeks had passed since the mess hall incident, but its echo still lingered in every corner of Fort Red Haven. The clatter of trays, the hum of voices, the metallic scrape of boots against concrete, all of it had returned. On the surface, normal life resumed, but beneath, something unspoken pulsed through the base. An invisible scar. New recruits sat down at tables without knowing why certain seats remained empty. Old hands gave them looks sharp enough to explain without words. The official record was closed. The commander had issued his warning. The MPs had filed their reports. But base culture doesn't move at the pace of paperwork. It carries its own memory, stubborn, unfiltered. She kept her routines, morning runs, quiet meals by the window, precision in the supply yard, on the surface unchanged. But Cole noticed the small shifts. The way her eyes lingered half a second longer on certain doorways. The way her runs stretched farther along the perimeter road, as if she needed space the base couldn't give. She was steady, always steady, but steadiness can hide strain. Mason's crew carried their own changes. Mason still had the frame, the square jaw, but his voice came out softer now. Smirk dulled at the edges. His laughter, rare, hesitant. Troy kept to himself. He worked long hours, sweat soaking through shirts until exhaustion forced him still. He avoided mess halls, avoided eyes. He drilled harder, carried discipline like a punishment. None of them said the word apology, but their silence was confession enough. Outside the wire, though, the story was already mutating. Rumors traveled faster than orders. A logistics officer from another post dropped it in passing. You hear about the woman at Red Haven. An Air Force tech sergeant nodded, curiosity sharpening his gaze. 5 recruits, less than a minute. Even when the details blurred, the core held. Underestimated, surrounded, decisive. And then the man in khakis appeared. A Navy officer, salt and pepper hair, insignia half concealed beneath his jacket. He didn't announce himself. He just stopped by the supply yard, watched her move crates like anyone else. Then he spoke, one word. Petty officer. The title landed like a password. She froze only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Cole saw it, recognition, history. Her face stayed neutral, but her eyes betrayed something he couldn't name. The officer smiled faintly. Didn't expect to find you here. Her reply came measured, temporary assignment. He nodded, his gaze lingered. We'll talk before I leave. And then he was gone. Afterward, Cole watched her movements sharpen. Each lift, each step, each breath clipped, controlled. He didn't need to ask, he already knew. The fight had been a spark, but the fire had spread beyond Red Haven's fences. And soon it was going to circle back. The envelope arrived at dawn, slid under her door. No name, no stamp, just a seal. Cole saw her later, sitting in the mess hall, coffee steaming, eyes locked on a single sheet of text. She folded it once, slid it into her pocket, continued eating. Cole caught her glance from 2 tables away, the faintest shake of her head. Not here, not now. It wasn't until dusk that he found her outside the motor pool. The yard was quiet, evening air cool against steel. She leaned against a crate, her face unreadable. "Transfer orders," she said simply, "effective immediately." He waited, she said nothing more. "Where?" She shook her head, "Doesn't matter." He studied her, the calm mask, the one that had unsettled him from the day she arrived. "So that's it," he said quietly. "Guess I won't have to worry about you causing trouble anymore." Her eyes flicked to his, a ghost of a smile there and gone. "I didn't cause trouble, Master Sergeant. I ended it." He almost smiled back, almost, but worry pressed against the edges of his respect. Paperwork would tell one story, the truth was something else, and truth had a way of following people. The next morning she stood in the yard with her duffel over one shoulder, signed off final checklists with the same precision she'd shown since day one. No wasted steps, no lingering. A few staff members came by, quick handshakes, short nods, respect without words. Mason and his crew stayed out of sight, whether out of shame or relief, no one could say. At 900, a black SUV rolled through the gate. No markings, tinted windows, the driver never stepped out. The rear door opened. She walked toward it without looking back, duffel steady on her shoulder, stride unbroken. She slid inside, the door closed. The SUV rolled away. The dust from its tires settled quickly, as though she'd never been there at all. But Fort Red Haven wasn't the same. Cole watched from the motor pool's shade. The table by the window sat empty. Recruits still whispered about 30 seconds. Conversations carried a hesitation where arrogance once lived. Discipline sharpened, not because of new rules but because of memory. Cole sat at her old table once just to see what she'd seen, the angles, the exits, the way the light fell without glare. It was the kind of detail you only noticed after someone taught you to. She had left, but her presence remained. Not as a name on a roster, not as a file in a cabinet, but as change, invisible, undeniable. Proof that some people alter places without trying. Proof that silence can rewrite rules louder than speeches. Proof that 30 seconds can live longer than 30 years of routine. And somewhere beyond the gates, wherever that SUV carried her, she was already slipping into another room, another mission, another silence. She wouldn't carry trophies, she wouldn't chase recognition. But she would leave behind the same thing she left here. A reminder. Quiet is not weakness. And dignity doesn't ask permission. The SUV delivered her to a city where doors locked from both sides. No unit patch, no welcome sign, a building with no nameplate, windows shaded, hallways painted in the same color as silence. Inside, she sat across from men and women who asked questions without asking. They slid a folder across the table, sealed. No names, no explanations. She opened it, skimmed the contents, closed it again. No protest, no curiosity, just a nod. Assignments never came to her with fanfare anymore. They arrived like shadows, briefings that weren't called briefings, conversations that were never logged. The work was quieter now, less about direct action, more about shaping conditions so someone else could succeed. She didn't mind. Noise had never been her language, precision was. But Red Haven had left its mark. She felt it first at a coastal training facility in the Pacific Northwest. Another yard, another set of crates, another mess hall that smelled faintly of steel trays and overcooked eggs. She sat alone, quiet, deliberate, back to the wall, same as always. And one night she heard it. 5 guys, gone in under a minute. Her fork paused midair. The voices came from 2 tables over. Young recruits, faces lit by curiosity, not cruelty. They say she never raised her voice, just wrecked them, like she was waiting for it. She chewed slow, swallowed, sipped her coffee, said nothing. The story wasn't supposed to follow her. And yet here it was, warped in places but intact where it mattered. 5 against 1, 30 seconds, silence as a weapon. She walked out without breaking stride, but the words clung to her like damp fabric. Waiting. That wasn't what it had been. She hadn't wanted any of it, but the story was no longer hers to correct. In Eastern Europe it found her again. NATO logistics, radios, manifests, crates. She moved as always, quiet, efficient, invisible. But at night, in the mess hall, she heard it again. A pair of junior officers, their English broken, their voices low but eager. She was military police, I heard, surrounded, but she. One leaned in, eyes bright. No intelligence, silent, she broke them, 5 men, gone. They disagreed on the details, but the bones of it remained, underestimated, surrounded, decisive. She listened stone still, ate in silence, finished her tray, walked out. Not fear, not pride, just inevitability pressing against her ribs. Because the story didn't belong to her anymore. And in the quiet of her temporary quarters, she replayed those 30 seconds, not with triumph, not with regret, with inevitability. She hadn't gone looking for it. She hadn't wanted it. But silence only works until someone mistakes it for weakness. And then silence has to speak. Still, one thought lingered, not the fight. She lived through worse in combat zones where hesitation cost lives. What lingered was Cole's voice. You could have handled that differently. It pressed into her nights like a splinter under the skin. Could she have? Could she have left the table, walked away, avoided it altogether? She doubted it. Mason and his crew weren't the kind to let silence stand. They would have followed, pressed, pushed, until her choices narrowed to the same point. But still the question lingered. Maybe there had been another path. She carried that splinter into every new room, every chow hall where she sat with her back to the wall, every briefing where her name wasn't spoken aloud, every mission where she played a role no one admitted existed. Words haunted her. You could have handled that differently. One rainy night in an unnamed city, she sat across from a contact in a dim. Steam rose from chipped porcelain cups. Neon lights smeared across wet glass. The man leaned in, lowering his voice. They're still telling that story, you know, 5 against 1. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, just sipped her coffee. Doesn't matter where you go, the man continued. People remember the ones who don't waste words. Her reply came flat. They can remember the story, just not the name. The man studied her, leaned back, nodded faintly as if he understood. But she knew he didn't. No one did. She walked out the same way she had left every room at Red Haven, calm, steady, unbothered on the surface. But inside, the splinter shifted again. The world wasn't going to let her go, not entirely, not while silence could still be mistaken for surrender. And she wondered, not for the first time, how many more times she'd have to remind people of the difference. What happens when your name becomes a rumor? When the details of your life slip from your hands and turn into a story carried by strangers? She had been living with that question ever since the mess hall. She didn't seek recognition, she didn't want it. But recognition had a way of hunting her down anyway, even when cloaked in whispers and half-truths. At night she sometimes lay awake, staring at ceilings that all looked the same. The words crawled under her skin. You remind me of someone. Was that who she was now? A reflection of a rumor. A ghost carrying fragments of herself from place to place, leaving nothing solid behind. Isolation pressed heavier with each move. At Red Haven, she'd had Cole's steady presence. A man who didn't need explanations to see what was in front of him. Now there was no one, just new faces, new assignments, new exits to map. The absence became its own weight, a hollow that didn't speak. And in the quiet moments between assignments, when her duffel sat packed by the door and the clock ticked toward departure, she felt it most. the certainty that no room would ever belong to her. One evening, in an eastern city, rain drumming against the windows of she sat across from a liaison. He looked at her with the quiet recognition of someone who knew more than he said. "They're still telling that story," he murmured. 5 against 1. She stared at her coffee, steam curling upward. "People tell stories all the time." "Not like this one," his tone sharpened. "This one spreads." He leaned closer. "Doesn't matter where you go, people remember the ones who don't waste words." Her gaze lifted, steady, flat. "They can remember the story, just not the name." He studied her for a beat, nodded as if satisfied. But she knew better. Understanding was rare, and memory was merciless. She walked back to her quarters in the rain, the city lights bleeding across wet pavement, the splinters sharper than ever. She wasn't afraid of being known. She was afraid of being remembered wrong. And yet she kept moving. Assignment to assignment, room to room, a ghost with a name stripped away, leaving only silence. What she didn't see, what she couldn't, was how deeply that silence was reshaping the places she touched. At Red Haven, laughter was quieter now, arrogance dimmed. At the coastal facility, recruits instinctively shifted their chairs to keep walls at their backs. At the NATO outpost, younger soldiers asked fewer careless questions, listened more. She didn't stay long enough to notice, but her absence was teaching as much as her presence ever had. And though she would never admit it, the lesson was beginning to cut both ways. What happens when silence is no longer a shield, but a weight? That question pressed against her as she stepped into yet another nameless. The air stale with cigarettes, plaster damp with rain. The city outside older than memory, every wall carrying echoes of war. She had been moving for months now, Pacific Northwest, Eastern Europe, further east where the streets narrowed and neon bled into darkness. Each assignment temporary, each duffel packed before it gathered dust. She didn't mind the motion. It was standing still that hurt. But tonight she wasn't alone. And for the first time, the silence pressing in around her was not hers alone to carry. What happens when silence collides with others who live the same way? That was the question pressing at the edges of her mind as she stepped into that night. 4 operators waited inside. No introductions, no long stories, just clipped nods, voices pared down to necessity. Each one carried themselves with the weight of history, people who had seen too much and said too little. They called each other by short names, or none at all. The room smelled of damp plaster and cigarettes. Rain drummed steady against the windows. She was used to silence, but shared silence felt different. It pressed against her, heavy and unfamiliar, the kind that forces you to measure your place inside it. The mission was simple on paper: follow a courier, a man whose briefcase carried information sharp enough to cut balances if it crossed the wrong border. Watch shadow, intercept clean. No noise. No spectacle. But paper doesn't bleed. 3 nights into surveillance, the courier shifted his pattern. Rain slicked cobblestones, alleys slick with oil and shadow. Instead of the expected stop, he slipped sideways into a narrow passage, quick, decisive. The team scattered without words, instincts splitting them like water finding channels. She took the north end, boots soft against wet stone, her breath even, every sense stretched taut. She caught him near a service entrance, fumbling with keys. But he wasn't alone. 2 escorts slid from the shadows, armed, eyes sharp. Her pulse didn't spike, her silence steadied it, but inside the decision point tightened. Engage now alone. Hold, wait for backup, risk losing him. The splinter returned. You could have handled that differently. But hesitation was not silence. Silence was control. She stepped forward. The escorts moved first. One reached for his weapon too slow. Her elbow cut upward, sharp into his throat. He collapsed against the wall, choking on air. Pivot, heel strike into the second's knee, a crack under the rein. He folded, cursing. The courier fumbled with the briefcase, eyes wide. Her hand locked his wrist, twisted, wrenched the case free before his panic caught up. The second escort lunged wild. She dragged him forward, momentum betraying him, shoulder to wall, a controlled drop. It was fast, precise, but not quiet. The scuffle echoed, bouncing off wet stone, louder than she wanted. The rest of the team arrived seconds later, guns raised, eyes sharp. The courier was already on the ground, the escorts groaning. She stood above them, briefcase in hand. The leader stepped forward, a woman with ice-gray eyes and a scar cutting her cheek like a second smile. She studied the scene, not with judgment but recognition. "You don't wait long, do you?" Her reply was flat. She offered the briefcase. "Waiting gives them time." Gray eyes accepted it, nodded once. Not approval, not warning, something in between. By dawn, the courier was someone else's problem. The briefcase locked in another set of hands. The team dispersed like shadows at sunrise, vanishing down their own corridors. But the moment lingered. In the quiet afterward, sitting alone in yet another room with walls that weren't hers, she felt the isolation heavier than before. Not because she'd fought, that was inevitable, but because when the moment came, she hadn't waited. She hadn't trusted anyone else to close the gap. And for the first time, she wondered if silence had hardened into something else. Into a wall she couldn't see past. She remembered Cole. His voice steady, not accusing. "You could have handled that differently." Back then she had dismissed it, but now, watching rain streak the window, she let the question hang. Was her silence strength? Or was it armor she no longer knew how to remove? The next day she heard it again. Not his voice this time, but the story. 5 against 1, someone whispered in another tongue. She didn't even speak, just moved. Different city, different country, same bones. It wasn't her name anymore. It was the legend of silence. A woman who didn't speak until action forced her hand. And for the first time, she wondered if the story wasn't about her at all anymore. Maybe it belonged to those who needed it. Young soldiers who needed to believe in quiet strength. Recruits who needed to see dignity without noise. But where did that leave her? That night she sat across from a cracked mirror in her quarters. The reflection stared back, familiar but distant. A scar along her jaw, eyes that never softened, shoulders that never slumped. She whispered the thought aloud, though no one heard it. Am I still me, or just the story? Her voice sounded foreign in the small room. She hadn't spoken in hours. Silence folded back in like a second skin. The missions blurred, cities without names, rooms without permanence, some with teams, most alone. Each time the story whispered ahead of her or followed just behind. "You remind me of someone." The phrase repeated, spoken by strangers who didn't know her, who only knew the rumor. She never answered. But when the lights dimmed and the noise fell away, the words crawled beneath her skin. "You remind me of someone. Someone, not yourself. Someone else." And with each mission, the weight pressed deeper. Not the violence, she could live with that. But the absence, the hollow that silence left when there was no one to share it with. At Red Haven, Cole had been there, watching, steady, a presence that asked nothing, demanded nothing, but understood enough. Here there was no one. And in the absence, she found herself asking questions she couldn't afford to. Was her silence still hers? Or had it been stolen by the story? The rain kept falling, cities kept shifting, missions kept stacking like bricks. And she kept moving. Always moving. Because standing still was the one thing she could not do. What happens when a story you never asked for finally meets you on the battlefield? She didn't think about Red Haven anymore, not consciously, but sometimes in quiet moments she'd feel the echo of that cafeteria, the scrape of chairs, the crack of bone, the stillness afterward. And then she'd hear his voice again. "You could have handled that differently." It was the one line she had never been able to silence. By now, the story had traveled farther than she had. Mess halls in the Pacific Northwest, NATO outposts in Eastern Europe, cities she never named, she never lingered in, always whispered the same way. 5 against 1, 30 seconds. She had become a ghost without choosing to. A shadow passed from one soldier to another, the nameless woman who carried silence like a weapon. But in the desert, ghosts don't stay hidden. She was assigned as logistics support at a windswept outpost where sand chewed at engines and wind erased footprints by dawn. On paper, she was nobody. Off paper, her silence carried weight that paperwork couldn't bury. One evening, in the mess tent, she heard it again. This time from the mouth of a recruit, his voice loud enough to carry across the canvas walls. 5 against 1, she didn't even raise her voice, dropped them all. Another recruit leaned closer, eyes wide. "Yeah, I heard she was CIA, or maybe Delta. No one knows for sure." Laughter followed, nervous, not cruel, the kind of laughter that masks fear. She sat alone at the far table, her fork still, her gaze steady. She said nothing. She never did. But inside, the splinter twisted. They weren't talking about her anymore. Not really. They were talking about an idea, a ghost made of silence. That night she walked the perimeter road alone. The desert stretched endless, the stars sharp enough to cut. And for the first time, she let the thought slip past the walls she'd built. Maybe that's all I am now. A story, not a person, not me. The mission dropped the next morning. Simple on paper, it always was. Escort a convoy of aid workers through a stretch of road more dust than danger. 2 trucks, a handful of escorts, food, water, medical supplies. Nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at the storm waiting on the. 2 hours in, the first crack of gunfire tore through the air. The convoy jolted, tires screamed against gravel, dust rose in a choking wave. The lead vehicle shuddered under impact. Shouts broke out. The aid workers ducked, eyes wide, pressing against crates that couldn't protect them. The escort scrambled, rifles spitting short bursts at shadows they couldn't pin down. But she knew instantly. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't desperate gunfire. The patterns were too sharp, too disciplined. Whoever was out there knew the route, knew the timing, knew what they wanted. Her silence rose in her chest like water finding its level. Noise outside, stillness inside. The same stillness that had carried her in that mess hall, that alley in the rain, every nameless room she had walked through since. But this time, it wasn't just her. The aid workers' eyes locked on her, expecting something she hadn't promised them, hoping she was the ghost they'd heard about. And crouched nearby, the young recruit from the night before. His hands trembled against his rifle. His breath came in gasps. But his eyes flicked to her, wide searching. She saw it there. The story. The legend. The thing he believed in. For a heartbeat, she hated it. Hated that silence had turned her into something she was. But then she saw what it gave him. Not bravado, not arrogance. Hope. And that was when she understood. The story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to those who needed it. She leaned toward him, her voice low, steady, the first words she'd spoken in hours. Focus, breathe, one target at a time. His grip steadied, his breathing slowed. And then she rose. Dust swirled, bullets cracked. She moved the way she always did, precise, efficient, silent. Not 30 seconds this time. Longer, harder, each movement carrying weight not just for herself, but for the convoy crouched behind her. The ridge cleared slower than she wanted, faster than it should have. Enough attackers dropped, their formation breaking, retreating into the sand. And then silence fell again. The kind that follows gunfire like an aftershock. The convoy survived. No aid workers lost. The recruit still breathing, though his rifle shook in his hands. She stood at the edge of the road, sand whipping around her boots, breath steady. She felt no triumph, only inevitability. Back at the outpost, the story grew instantly. She didn't panic, didn't even raise her voice, just acted. The recruit told it first, his words trembling but certain. Others repeated it, trimmed some edges, added others. And within a day, the ambush wasn't just survival. It was another parable of silence. She didn't correct them. She didn't need to. That night she sat alone beneath the desert stars. The quiet stretched endless. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a thin smile. Not because of victory. Not because of recognition. But because she finally understood what her silence had become. It wasn't armor anymore. It wasn't a cage. It was a mirror. One that showed others what they needed to see. Strength, control, dignity without noise. And in the stillness of the desert night, she knew Cole would have said it differently. He would have argued about choices, about handling things another way. Maybe he would have been right. But watching the horizon fade into night, she found her own answer. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. Why do some names vanish, yet their silence lingers louder than memory? Weeks after the desert ambush, she found herself back in a city that didn't need her name. Different assignment, different cover, same rhythm. Move, observe, intervene only if silence broke first. The work was familiar, but something had shifted. Not in her, not exactly, in the way others looked at her. The recruit from the convoy, the one whose breath she steadied, told the story in every tent he passed through. He spoke with awe, with tremor, with gratitude, not for himself, but for what he'd seen in her silence. And from there it spread again. 5 against 1, 30 seconds. The desert ambush, dust and bullets, silence that steadied others. She became 2 stories now, carried on different tongues. Some believed she was CIA, some said Delta, some said no one knew. But all of them agreed on one thing: she never wasted words. She tried not to listen. She tried to stay buried in her work, her routines, her quiet meals. But rumors don't respect walls. And for the first time, she realized she no longer hated them. Because they weren't about her anymore. They were about what others needed her to be. The young, the untested, the ones who looked at silence and finally understood it could be something other than weakness. One evening she walked along a rooftop, the city sprawling below in neon and shadow. The mission was done. No fanfare, no acknowledgement, just another step between doors. And she thought about Red Haven. About the cafeteria table by the window. About Cole's steady presence. About the 5 who thought silence meant surrender. She remembered the crack of bone, the stillness afterward. And his voice. You could have handled that differently. It had haunted her, followed her across borders and time zones, a question she carried heavier than any weapon. But standing there above the city, she let the weight shift. Because maybe she had handled it the only way silence allows. Direct, sharp, uncomplicated. And maybe that was enough. The SUV pulled up before dawn, same as always. No insignia, no explanation. She climbed in without asking. Another city, another mission, another set of walls. But as the tires rolled over uneven streets, she leaned her head back and closed her eyes. For once she wasn't chasing silence. She was carrying it. And she understood now, it wasn't hers to own. It belonged to those who remembered it. those who whispered about it in mess halls, those who steadied their breath before combat because of it. It belonged to the recruit who had found focus in her calm, to Mason's crew who had learned respect in the hardest way possible. It even belonged to Cole, who had seen in her something worth protecting, even if he never said it aloud. She was just the vessel, and maybe that was the only way silence ever survives. Not by holding on to it, but by letting it live in others. The convoy of thought carried her across the city as the sun began to rise. And as light spilled over the horizon, she opened her eyes and whispered the words she never gave anyone else. Words only the empty car would hear. I was never the story. The words hung in the air, soft but unshakable. And with them came the truth she had been circling all along. She didn't need the story. She didn't need the recognition. All she needed was what silence had always given her: control, dignity, and the strength to act when action was the only answer. By the time the SUV vanished into another nameless compound, the legend had already outrun her again. In mess halls they still whispered. In barracks they still retold it. 5 against 1, 30 seconds, a woman who didn't waste words. She wasn't there to hear it anymore. She never would be. But that was the point. Some truths don't need witnesses. Some legacies don't need names. And some silences, when carried long enough, become louder than any sound. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.